Oh, that is bright. Thank you very much for having me out here today. I really appreciate that. Let's see if I can find a place to stand where I can see you guys too. Okay. Is the volume level okay? Everyone can hear me? All right, I know on a beautiful day like this, we don't get very many of them in the Northwest, so being indoors is a real struggle, so thank you again. My talk today has been a little bit condensed last minute, so I'm going to do my best to cover a lot of things really quickly, and then I'm happy to chat after if you guys have questions. And Jeff's going to cover all the biology stuff way better than I could anyway, so I'm going to skip all of that in my talk and really focus on the other aspects of growing that we think are important. So, made up this term, biological horticulture. You can Google it, you won't find anything because I just made it up on the spot because I think it really captures what I think is important about gardening. So we take the science of horticulture and then incorporate in a lot of the microbial aspects that are really the most important thing when we talk about organics. All right, so this is my farm. I'm pretty fortunate. We have a 7-acre farm and feed store up in Redmond, Washington. Would love to give anyone a tour if you ever make it up that way. We just recently had baby pigs. Again, it's our second batch of pigs. And we're an organic hydro shop. We don't carry or use any synthetics or chemical pesticides on the property or sell them to our customers. We don't do a lot of hydro sales, primarily just soils and fertilizers, organic amendments, minerals, things like that. We have a full-scale production nursery making veggie starts for the community. Growing them organically. We have an outdoor preschool for kids, which is a lot of fun. And then we have pigs, chickens, ducks, rabbits, all these different animals running around. So this is something we started about 4 years ago. It's really starting to take off. The other side of our business, which we kind of keep the two separate, is the whole idea of soils, primarily marketed towards the cannabis industry. Thank you for turning that light off. Let's see here. So this all started about 8 or 9 years ago with the idea of how do we grow the healthiest organic medicine possible. I think it's really important that we treat cannabis as medicine, that we grow it in a way that's going to be healthy. We're not adding in all these different plant growth hormones and regulators that could potentially cause cancer. That was a big issue about 5 years ago up in the Seattle area, and I assume down here too, where even things that were being a lot of things that were being sold that were not approved for edible crops and only approved for ornamental crops were still being put on cannabis because they made denser buds or made systemic pesticides, so you wouldn't have to worry about spider mites your entire grow cycle. But those things are still in the leaf tissue, and then we're consuming them, which I think is a big issue. So not only that, but we have to be affordable about it. So whether we're growing it ourselves or this is a business that you're a part of, expenses are always an issue. So those are the two main factors that came about when we were designing and creating soil. So I grew up on a retail nursery. I had never walked into a hydro shop until about a decade ago. And this is what I saw when I walked in the door. And I didn't see a single plant, which kind of blew me away. Growing up on a nursery, like this is just something that you expect. You expect to be surrounded by plants. And I was really curious. So I thought that cannabis was this special plant. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying it's not special, but it is called weed for a reason. It's not difficult to grow. There's a million ways you can grow cannabis. So I'm not saying that my way is the best, but this is the way that we like to grow it. But one of the things I will say is a lot of these products here, like rhino skin, for example, it's potassium silicate. You can get a product called Agsil 16H. It's a powdered version of potassium silicate. You can make your own Dynagrow Protect, the same concentrations for under $10 per gallon. Way cheaper. There's no reason we have to pay for these brand names. I'm going to highlight a couple here in a second without going into it too much because I don't have a lot of time. But Molasses is a great example. You see products like Bud Candy and Strapped and all these things that are essentially just organic blackstrack molasses. So for Bud Candy, you can pay up to $170 for a 2.5 gallon bucket. In our feed store, for example, we sell essentially the same product for $20 for a 3.5 gallon bucket. So when you talk about things like liquid karma that are a combination of maybe molasses and seaweed extract powder and maybe a little bit of humic acid, when you actually look at the label and what you're paying for, 99% of it is water. So we just encourage people to look at labels and be aware of what they're buying and realize that not all nutrient companies have your best interest in mind when it comes to the bottom line and what you're spending money on. Humic acids is another one I like to mention. Diamond Black, for example, 6% humic acid by content. The Roots product is 0.1% humic acid by content. You're really not getting a lot of humic acid for your money. Whereas, for example, TerraVita, a company that we work with, they have a powder that's 85% humic acid by content. You're using 1/8 of a teaspoon per gallon when you water, and that's coming out of the ag industry. They don't even sell to the hydro or cannabis industry. And this is sort of where I came from and where I grew up, and that's where I really think a lot of things are heading in this industry. As the price for cannabis goes down, the cost to grow it is going to have to go down too if people want to stay competitive without sacrificing the quality of their crops. So our big thing is by heavily amending the soil or using what we like to call water-only soils. You may have heard the term super soil. Well, we can't use that anymore because Scott's owns that, the patent on that word. So I think that might be part of the reason TGA went out of business. I don't know. We had our bags all ready to go to print, and then they said super soil on them at the last minute. We had to cut the line. So we like to use the term water-only soils, with the idea being that by putting all the amendments directly into a soil that has good biological activity, you're really putting the plant in charge. So we're putting in almost 100 pounds of organic amendments and minerals, and a lot of them aren't even plant available that first cycle. Some of the things in the basalt and the glacial rock dust aren't going to break down that first cycle, but our goal is that people are going to reuse it. We do direct microscopy on our soils and compost, and then lab testing so that I can look at the soil over various cycles, and we can see what levels are building up, which levels are a little deficient, and we can amend accordingly. And we've been doing this for the last 7 or 8 years now. We have some gardens that are 4 or 5 years old before replacing the soil, but I'll get into that in a second. So some of the advantages that I mentioned before, it puts the plant in charge. It allows for optimal plant health and growth. You require less inputs, which you'll also reduce your plant stress. You'll get increased terpenes and cannabinoids. So one of the things that Carlos talked about is by changing different levels of nutrients and by having different levels of biological activity in your soil, what you'll see is you'll have different odors and flavors being expressed in your crop. So that's one of the things that the only complaint I've ever gotten was one gentleman in regards to the soil was how he didn't like how the odor had changed when he switched to using our soil versus his current program, and that's a legitimate thing because it may change. The biggest things that I think are important is the fact that the soil is reusable. For some of you guys, that just seems like a crazy concept, and other of you guys, it's like, duh, I've been reusing my soil forever now. So it really just depends where you're coming from, but our goal is to get people to reuse the soil because it's so expensive to, just from a labor perspective, to buy new soil in, move it into the facility, and then dispose of that same soil, and your environmental impact is huge. This is our giant pumpkin that we grew 2 years ago. Last year's they kind of failed, but this was a 725 pounder. I'm shooting for over 1,000 pounds this year. We heavily amend the soil and then just water it and let it do its thing. So a lot of it's genetics, but I do think in part it's just because we have great soil. I think if you invest in your soil, it makes gardening and growing so much more fun. On the retail garden side, I can't tell you how many people come in, these homeowners that will spend $30,000 on their landscape, and then they put in this terrible topsoil, and all their plants start dying, and they're constantly trying to save them. And if they had just spent a little bit more on the quality of their soil, their plants would be happy, and they wouldn't even have to come into our store. It makes such a difference. Biochar is one thing that I like to highlight really quickly. It's something that is a component of one of the soils that we make. It's sort of a relatively new product to the industry. All I really want to say about it is it raises the carbon levels, and what people are seeing is, at least in general, what I've noticed, about 8 to 10% better growth in yield using it properly. The way we use it is we soak it for a week in fish hydrolysate before adding it into our soil at 10% of our total media. Agriculturally, they're using it at 1 to 2%. It's seeing better health and yields. The company that we work with is Black Owl Biochar. I really like that company. They're using virgin forest slash, which sounds terrible, but it's actually stuff that would normally be burned there right on the site or create a problem for the lumber industry. So it's a byproduct of the lumber industry. let's see here, just to move along. This is a photo from Gold Leaf Gardens. This is my my buddy Jaya. He's doing using a par meter to measure the or a light meter to measure the par levels in their facility. And these guys have 4x4 beds and the biochar soil, and they claim they're getting 3 pounds per light with a dialed-in CO2 room with thin mint cookies, which kind of blew me away because that's not a heavy yielding cultivar. The only point to that, I don't usually use yield or pounds per light sort of things, other than to say that I don't think you're sacrificing anything by switching to organics. This is a hybrid method, so this is one of the ones we worked with, Green Rush. They have a better photographer. I wouldn't say they actually grow a better pot, though they do a great job. These are all 502 guys. This is a facility over in up north, Smoky Point Productions. This is all on our soil. So these guys are all, I think they're using like the NutriCulture and then our soil. And they're getting great results, but they're still dumping their soil. I've tried to get them over to strictly organic programs, but it's hard. People don't, you get used to growing a certain way, and you become an expert in growing in that way. And it's really hard to make a transition, especially when it's a business and it's something that you're relying on every crop. In terms of recycling the soil, a few of the benefits I like to point out, though. So you have reduced labor costs. I know with our farm, my biggest expense is labor, and soil is not fun to move back and forth out of facility. You save a ton of money, not only not buying the soil, but not having to move it. You don't have the disposal cost of getting rid of that soil. And the way that we like to do it, before I get into those photos, I just want to talk about this point right here. I think this is going to be the next big issue after the whole pesticide problem that we just encountered in Washington State. I just did a consult last week, and I literally walked in the facility where they were mixing nutrients, and they're on a synthetic mineral salt program, and they had a 250-gallon IBC tote that they were just draining into this massive drain in the middle of the floor. And I just asked them, like, where's that going? They're like, oh, well, we have a septic system. They're literally across the street from the Fish and Wildlife Services. I'm like, you guys are going to the EPA is going to be out here eventually. They're going to want to know why all the groundwater in your area is highly contaminated with nitrates and phosphates. They're going to shut you down. Like, this is something you need to think about now. And I think it's going to be the next big thing that people are going to have to deal with. So think about the environment. If you Google the word dead zones in the ocean, you'll see a lot of the groundwater contamination is coming from these chemical fertilizers. So I think it's really important that we protect that. Here's just an example of one of our soil tests. I just show these to make up prove the point that by doing these soil tests, you can see where your soil's at. You can see what needs to be amended, and then you can properly amend your soil. And that's something we've done every cycle, 4 cycles a year for up to 4 years, so we can see how those levels are, and we can amend accordingly. This is a bed that realistically what we're doing here when we're re-amending the soil, we're not pulling this much soil out. We're literally just pulling the plant. Whatever comes out with the plant, we shake off the roots, and then plant back into it we re-amend it with a little bit of the nutrient pack, a little bit of a high-quality compost, and possibly a little bit of perlite or pumice, depending on the physical properties of the soil, how well it's draining. And then we replant 24 hours later. So there's no downtime, and that bed just stays there. We like to use blue mats, which I think I will have a slide on here in a second. I show this photo because even the photography is not great. This is one of our rooms. This is over 2 years old, this crop. And it cost him under $50 for all the nutrients amendments. I believe he was right around 1.5 pounds per light, using single-ended bulbs and no CO2. Again, same thing. These are all old soil, so it's recycled soil. This is a photo I took of the Seattle Times, not too long ago in February. It's just now becoming an issue where people are aware of what people are spraying on their crops. This is a huge problem. I believe that there are organic solutions for just about any pest that cannabis face, whether it's broad mites or thrips or powdery mildew. All of these things you can treat successfully with proper I hate the term IPM, but with proper pest management, I think is the best way to look at it. You don't necessarily need to spray, but by bringing in beneficial insects, by starting with a better soil so you have a healthier plant, these are all ways that you can control pathogens. So some of the things that we've learned, using organic soils, you don't need to flush the soil. There's really nothing to flush out. The nutrients are not in an ionic form that the plant can assimilate. And really the plant's going to go into natural senescence at the rate that it wants to. You don't need to pH any nutrients or additives. The plant and the soil actually has amazing buffering capacity. In fact, the roots can buffer or adjust the pH quite a bit just based on the exudates it's putting out. There's some great studies on that. There's a huge range for amending soil and adding nutrients. A lot of people will use their current fertigation program. So if you're used to running Botanicare, for example, you could run Botanicare at a quarter strength in our soil, and I believe you would still get better results. It's best to keep the soil evenly moist, so avoid those wet-dry cycles, because when you think about it, if we're really trying to create the best environment for microbes, we want to keep the soil from getting really, really dry or oversaturated with water. And we like to give people an accurate assessment of what that looks like. So if you have a moisture meter, they're about $50-$60 bucks for the ones that I like. They're from a company called Blue Mats. And we like to keep the soil between 80 and 120 MBAR. And it only takes a few minutes to get a reading. And I think dialing in your watering is the most important aspect of gardening, short of starting with a high-quality media. And the last thing is soil improves over time. You can't get a living, ecologically balanced, perfect soil out of a bag. This is something that you have to establish over time through your care for the land and your care for the soil. So that's why I think it's so important to recycle the soil. In fact, what we're seeing is typically that second or third crop is really where you get an increase in yield and health and growth. So again, recycling the soil is really important. And then lastly, the big point I think is investing in your soil. By having a high quality media, whatever that media is, you're just going to end up with a better, healthier crop. Rather than trying to play God and add all these nutrients when you think the plant needs them, the plant can really control that process. And that's something that Jeff's going to talk about in his speech. So that is the quick version of my talk. A couple resources. KISSorganics.com is our website. If you haven't read Jeff's book, highly recommend it. My second favorite gardening book, no offense to Jeff, is The Intelligent Gardener by Steve Solomon. He wrote Gardening West of the Cascades. Jeff really covers in Teaming with Microbes a lot of the microbial interactions, and one of the things that Steve covers in his book is a lot of the mineral amendments. So the concept there is if you get all the minerals into the soil, then the plant's able to uptake what it needs, and it will help with the biological activity and microbial communities of the soil, and everything works out for the best. So last thing I want to say is logicalgardener.org is a science-based horticulture forum that I run with a friend of mine, Tim Wilson, of Microbe Organics. It's totally free. There's no advertising on it. There's a lot of great information. It's just something that we do on the side because soil is something we're passionate about. And there is a medical section for medicinal plants. So thank you for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it. Are we okay for time on questions? All right. I guess we have time for a few questions. Yes? What do you think about using enzyme products like hydrozyme? Yes, hydrozyme. Great question. In fact, I was just talking with a friend of mine who was invaluable for me in creating the soil. And what he's discovered in terms of enzymes is you can actually take whole malted barley. In fact, I just picked up a whole bunch at Steinbart's myself today. You can take that and grind it without heating it, so ideally milling it or crushing it, and then applying it to your plant at about a quarter cup per plant. And he says that that's another way of getting all those enzyme benefits without having to invest in a really expensive enzyme product, because most of those are from barley. Are you talking about top layering it? Yeah, just top dressing, literally taking it and then watering over the top of it. Yeah. You can send me an email later and I can give you a little more detail on it. Yeah, I'll get you next time. Yeah, so for me, I prefer peat moss, but there's nothing wrong with cocoa. The reason I like peat is because it contains beneficial biology already. We're relatively close to where it's sourcing, though there are some issues with the sustainability of it. I've heard pros and cons in terms of some people say we're maintaining our peat bogs, other people say we're depleting them. Cocoa has the fossil fuel issue of getting it here. Neither is a complete solution. One thing maybe Randy will touch on is the salinity of cocoa and how you do need to test that to make sure that you're not applying cocoa that's really high in salts. And that's something they've figured out too. Yeah. Oh, right behind you. Yeah.
From my experience with highly biologically active soilless media is that the more biologically active it is, the faster the microbes break down the organic material, mostly physical chemicals.
Yes.
So it's kind of counterintuitive to me that soil is immediately. So assuming yours is the soil media, then I understand it. It's like a soil-less media. How do you maintain that structural integrity?
It's a good question. So our mix, the way we start out, it's 50% Alaskan sphagnum peat moss, 33% pumice, 2/3 of which is medium pumice, and 1/3 which is large pumice. And then the other 17% is a combination of compost and earthworm castings. So so every time you harvest a plant, you're pulling out organic matter, you're pulling out nutrients. So those need to be replaced. But when you add organic matter, you don't want to grow in 100% compost. So that's where we add in aeration in the form of perlite or pumice over time. Did that answer your question?
Sure. So you maintain it by keeping the same base.
Just the top part, yeah. So the first couple inches are used to being naturally disturbed in the environment. So those microbes have adapted to those conditions. We're not tilling it every time. So it's a semi no-till system, I guess you could say. That's become more popular on a lot of the forums over the last, couple of years. We're adding about a cubic foot per yard of additional organic matter in the form of compost or earthworm castings every time we recycle the soil. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, we've gotten them all. Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of, you're talking about thermally heating up the soil by using the microbes to balance your seed to end ratio, essentially composting the soil. What we find is once the soil is in place, when we re-amend it, we're not re-amending at high enough rates for the soil to actually heat up. We don't have to. So initially, we're putting in the equivalent of about 6 of our nutrient packs per yard, but when we go to re-amend it, we're only putting in about half of a nutrient pack per yard to 1 nutrient pack. So about a 1/6 the amount of nutrients go back into it because those minerals are breaking down. That's another question, but I can say we've successfully dealt with everything from root aphids, thrips, powdery mildew, spider mites. That would be more in depth than I could cover right at the moment. That's a whole other talk or conversation, but I'm happy to talk to you about it later. But I think you can solve all those things and still preserve the soil 99% of the time. Yeah. All right, I guess last question, so I'll get off the stage. Yeah. Sure. Sure. So we started as a compost tea company. In fact, the lab tests in Jeff's book, original book, I don't know if they're still in there now, were from our company. So compost tea was what we did for a decade before we ever started making soils. Big proponents of compost tea. It's not necessarily something that I try and talk everyone into that, starting out. But if you're using the soil, I think compost tea is a great complement to that. By adding additional beneficial microbes, it's only going to help things. And there's no issues with that. So a lot of those teas, we do have a list of things you can use with the soil. But the idea started was that if you were a medical patient and you walk into a hydro shop, rather than getting hit with all of these products, you could literally be handed a bag and say, hey, you water your plants and you'll get a good organic yield. And then from that, we kind of figured out that we can re-amend the soil and we can do all these other things as a way of expanding upon that so that it scales well for commercial growers as well. Okay. Oh, we're okay on time? Oh, it went fast. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yes, so Neem cake or Neem seed meal, it's another product it's the leftovers from the oil pressing. It's great as, I use it to treat fungus gnats. So I'll take 2 cups and put it in a 5-gallon bucket and stir it or aerate it for 48 hours until it's solubilized, and then I water the surface of the soil. Keeping in mind, though, that it is a natural pesticide, so it will kill off some of your beneficial organisms. That's where compost tea comes in really well as a way of replenishing when you do kill things off. Because the first thing into a system after a pesticide application is typically a pathogen. They're just more successful at getting into these primary systems. The neem cake tea is sort of what, like I said, I use is to water. I haven't used it with kelp. I love kelp meal, but for different reasons than, so if I'm applying a neem tea, yeah, I'm probably getting a little bit of nitrogen, but it's primarily as a pesticide. Whereas when I'm putting kelp meal, I'll put that directly into the soil, or I'll use seaweed extract powder as a 100% soluble thing that I can put into the water. And that's more to pick up all the different plant growth hormones and regulators, all the different elements. You know, kelp has over 70 different elements in it. It's it's probably my favorite thing when it comes to soil. Things that I have to have in my soils whenever I garden are kelp meal and organic alfalfa meal. Those are my 2 favorites. Yeah. So neem cake, from the research that I've seen, by adding it into your soil as part of your mix, you will get some of the nitrogen benefits. But really, it's going to break down the enzymes, the azidiractin and things don't stick around to kill off fungus gnats throughout that first cycle. You'd be better off doing the barley or adding in some crab meal or crustacean meal as a way of picking up chitinase, which is an enzyme that helps break down the shells, or it has a mechanism that kills a lot of the bugs, if that makes sense. Yep. Okay. Thank you.